In that room, she's in that room soon.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, I'm no qua Osinachi. One man Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama Osinachi.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. The section starts now. However, the chair is not here yet, so I think we'll give her minutes. Thank you very much.
just for the hosts, I think the session is supposed to start at 3:45 p.m. Nigerian time. So I'm guessing that's why the chair and the author haven't joined us. So perhaps in the next 4 minutes, I expect things to start. Meanwhile, Chijioke, how you doing? Fabian, nice to meet you guys.
Hello, bro.
How are you?
Fine, nice to see you.
Same here. Do you know if Ade is in Nigeria? Perhaps he's somewhere
I don't think he's in Nigeria.
Okay.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, I'm no qua, Osinachi. One man, Osinachi, I'm watching. Hey, Osinachi, mama, Osinachi.
Hello, everyone. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me? Sakiru.
Yes,
How are you?
Prof, I can hear you. Good morning from here.
Very good. So, do we wait a couple of minutes for people to join in?
Actually, I think people are in. This is the panelist page, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
The participants. Okay. So, we can begin. My name is Arthur Quayson. I am at Stanford University. And it's truly a pleasure and delight to chair this session on Sakiru Adebayo's Continuous Pasts, a copy of which I have here. And I'm going to just spend very little time talking about it because I want the panel participants, the discussants to do their thing. The first thing to note, which may seem quite banal, is how small the book looks. However, the word small is not the right epithet for it. Even though it looks small, I would rather say it's concise rather than small, because Adebayo chooses his quarrels really, really carefully. It's not like some people that every intellectual mosquito they'll be fighting with. He doesn't do that. So you can see he's citing lots of people, but only a few people he gives room to discuss. So the theoretical apparatus is fundamentally of his own making and choosing. This is quite different from what you see in normally a first book. Normally the first book is where you pay your debts, you flex your muscles, you show that you've read Tom, Dick, and Harry, you quarrel with lots of people. Adebayo doesn't do that. He has slimlined the whole thing. I mean, there were points when I was reading, I was thinking, he could have thrown a punch here easily, theoretically. He could have expanded, this area and that area. But as I continue reading, I saw the judiciousness of his choices. So which then means that the book doesn't have clutter. And that's why it's so concise. So small is not the word, it's so concise. But more importantly, the argument is full of insights. You can see that he's synthesized a lot of material and thinking. But most importantly, the entire enterprise is grounded on very good and exquisite close readings of texts. Just very quickly, the chapter that I found there, especially productive for me because of my own thinking on these things, was the chapter on chapter 3. The past continues in another country. The melancholia that we find in Children of the Revolution, the struggles that the three friends have to embed and locate themselves in the context of Washington, D.C., where, of course, they are brushing against two contradictory forces. One is the nostalgia for things past, Ethiopia, Kenya, and so on, which, as it were, orchestrates all their longings. All their longings are orchestrated around those nostalgias. But on the other hand is a racist America. So on the one hand, nostalgia and the racist America then produces problems for grounding of the self-identity, and so on. And, he does a really, really exquisite job of showing the multiple contradictions and the fact that in spite of the problems that these two, as it were, realities impose on these migrants, or diasporics, a better word, they also try to rehearse modes of embedding in this within this American culture, which is also claims to be multicultural and receptive to precisely the kinds of exercises that they attempt. So one of the characters knows so much about American history that he even tries to correct a professor of history, American. And there are various other things. But these rehearsals of the nationalist discourse, American. So there's rehearsals of different nationalist discourses. Ethiopia is one, predominantly. Kenya is, of course, another one. But also America. What is America? So the novel raises all kinds of questions, or more importantly, Sakiru deploys the novel to raise all kinds of questions. It's a very interesting. I was, furiously underlining and taking notes and making because I'm teaching a class on. Actually, let me fess up right away. Admit that I'm teaching a class on next year on global Black diasporas. Global Black diasporas is going to be comparative and so on, but diasporas not limited to the Black Atlantic episteme. So the Black Atlantic episteme will be explored. It gives us a good way of erecting another, or seeing the lineaments of another episteme, which is not exclusively the Black Atlantic episteme. Anyways, so let me pause there. It's a wonderful book. I think that if Sakiru continues in this concise, judicious, critical acuity, see, all my big English is coming out. When we were kids, to prove that you went to school, you have to master big English. So words like hypotenuse, we didn't know what it meant, but you make sure that you use hypotenuse anywhere you can. If he continues in this path, he will be one to watch. I see all the signs of, the makings of a great scholar of his generation who will transcend. So I'm very pleased with the book, and looking forward to the discussion. So without much ado, I surrender the next. Sorry, unfortunately I've closed the email showing the lineup. So Sakiru, who will be after me?
I am also not very sure.
Okay.
Does anyone know?
Okay, Chigo. I see Chigo's face is next to mine on the tile. That's the beauty of Zoom. He's tiled up. Chigo's face is tiled up on so he'll be next, and then we'll see who the tile manifestations of our identities. So Chigo, you are next, and you will have Sakiru. We agreed. Is it 20 minutes each or 15?
15
minutes.
Okay, 15 minutes each, and I'll try and keep time, but please go ahead. Chigo.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Christine. I think you've said it all. Achebe said, the man who said my neighbor has said it all doesn't have anything to say. But in this case, actually, you've said a lot of what I outlined to say about the book. It's a very fascinating book. But first, I would like to thank Dr. Sakiru Adebayo for inviting me to be on this book launch panel with so many of you guys whose intellectual works I greatly, really admire. And let me also congratulate Dr. Adebayo yet again for writing such terrific book. And I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book and that I learned a lot from it. In part, again, chapter 3 was I'm biased, but that was one of my favorite chapters of the book. And like Professor Quisin's experience of reading this book, I mean, the extensive body of secondary literatures that Adebayo consulted in writing this book is, to put it simply, quite intimidating. And one of the things that I think enriched my reading of the book was having to take copious notes of your engagement with these works. Okay, let me distill and see what makes sense. What I think I will try to do briefly is to mention a few things that I have outlined. And unfortunately, 15 minutes, will not be sufficient to even begin the work of introducing this book properly. So my aim generally is to give a kind of sketchy review of the book, just to provoke further interest in the book with a few preliminary observations that I've made. So continuous past frictions of memory in post-colonial Africa provides a fascinating reading of post-conflict fictions dealing with traumatic past in post-colonial Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. Adebayo manages to bring together an extensive body of theories from memory and trauma studies, post-colonial studies, and literary criticism to illuminate the complex artistic commitments to traumatic memory by contemporary African writers. And there are 4 literary texts at the analytical heart of Adebayo's book. First is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, Aminata Fona's The Memory of Love, Dino Mengistu's Children of the Revolution, and Veronique Tadio's The Shadow of Imana. And all 4 texts were published in the first decade of the 21st century. And Adebayo's comparative discussion of these works, I think, helps to track not only the centrality of traumatic memory in African writings, but also the commitment of African writers since the dawn of the new century to post-colonial traumatic histories. Hence, continuous past contributes to our understanding, first, of the significance of traumatic memory in African literature since the 20th century, and secondly, the ways that contemporary African writers have been narrativizing post-colonial traumatic memories in order to challenge the hegemony of post-colonial state histories. And in making these observations about post-colonial African literary turns to traumatic memory, Adebayo argues for an acknowledgement of African writings of the kind as post-conflict fictions of memory. He reads the 4 selected texts of the study as exemplars of the post-conflict African fiction of memory, and he argues that such fiction has become a veritable vector for the past to continue shaping the present, and that it provides imaginative possibilities for a collective African memory, or what he describes as a remembering together that gives impetus for a transnational African memory framework. Yet, it is somewhat unclear from the book why a continental or a Pan-African collective memory project is necessary, and what work it is or might be doing, and whether or not such a project is plausible and usable. In chapter 1 of the book, Adebayo discusses Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun as a post-memory fiction because the writer was born after the traumatic events of Biafra, and because, according to Adebayo, the novel derives essentially from traumatic memories Adichie collected from her family members. This chapter to me is a bit of an outlier to the rest of the book, and I considered it so because I sensed the author made more pronouncements about the novel based largely on interviews that Adichie gave years after the novel was published, and so tended to gloss the story of the novel. For one, Adebayo's reading of Half of a Yellow Sun as post-memory fiction seems a bit stretched. While it is the fact that Adichie was born some years after the Biafran War and presents as a good candidate for an exegesis of the theory of post-memory, her novel does not, in fact, deal with a post-memorial situation in relation to Biafra. In Half of a Yellow Sun, the trauma of Biafra is experienced by those who live through it directly. All the characters are situated within the historical context of the violence and not after it. There are no characters in the novel, to the best of my memory, who can be described as a second-generation trauma subject. The novel, I will contend instead, seems rather invested in the Biafran survival trauma and memory than in second-generation post-memory. But beside this stretch of the post-memory framework in relation to Adichie's novel, what seems of more consequence is that this first chapter manages to weaken the thesis of the book by positioning Adichie's novel as a caution against the employment of traumatic memory, by somewhat reading it as a catalyst for violence in Nigeria. For example, on page 45 of Continuous Past, Adebayo writes, "We have seen Biafra secessionist movements spring in the years following the release of Half of a Yellow Sun. ethnic tensions became remarkably fiercer after the publication of Chinua Achebe's There Was a Country in 2012. A little subsequently, Adebayo concludes, of course, Adichie does not necessarily have personal ties with Biafra secessionist groups and may not even buy into their politics. But Half of a Yellow Sun, among other recent stories on Biafra, has directly or indirectly sustained and aggravated conversations and agitations about the secession of Biafra. End of quote. Besides what I consider in Adebayo's statements here to be a fiction of inference, that is, that somehow Adichie's novel and others must have fueled recent Biafra secessionism in Nigeria, even though Adebayo doesn't bother to explain how a novel could do that and why Biafra writings of the 1980s and 90s, for example, did not provoke such secessionist sentiments. What I didn't understand is why the caution against writing Biafra traumatic memory that Adebayo advocates in this section of the book is necessary and useful, considering that only in this chapter in relation to Half of a Yellow Sun was such caution advanced, even though earlier in the introductory section of Continuous Past, Adebayo suggests that traumatic memory in Africa and elsewhere, in fact, serves importantly to trouble official histories and enforced silence and amnesia in post-colonial Africa. So if the work of traumatic memory is indeed to trouble official history, then I see no reason why such troubling has to be convenient or peaceful, to say the least. In chapter 2, Adebayo provides a compelling analysis of traumatic silence and memory in Fona's The Memory of Love. I think that a signal contribution of this chapter is the way it problematizes what the author describes as a Western approach to trauma therapy based on speech and testimony. Adebayo shows that in Fona's The Memory of Love, some traumatized characters prefer silence and other approaches to therapy that doesn't align with the logic of Western psychotherapy. And Adebayo shows in the context of the novel that silence can be a mechanism for testimony and therapy, as well as a strategic tool of distancing oneself from taking responsibility for complicity in violence. Yet, I was surprised that Adebayo does not use the frictions of silence in Fona's novel to trouble the extant assumptions of contemporary restorative and transitional justice regimes, insisting that traumatic memory can be restorative and that traumatic testimony and storytelling are viable sources of truth, healing, and reconciliation. If we are to understand that African writers invested in the project of traumatic memory are doing so against the oblivion of historical silence and amnesia, how are we then to understand the utility of silence that seems to be privileged in Fona's novel, as Continuous Past would have it? And even more importantly for me, I thought that there was a missed opportunity in this chapter to read the project of traumatic memory beyond the political project of healing and restoration. Is the goal of memory necessarily about healing, especially in post-colonial African context? Chapters 3 and 4, which are my favorites of Continuous Past, deal with the complex transnational dimensions of African traumatic memories. The chapter on Mengistu's Children of the Revolution maps the haunting effects of traumatic memories of violent conflict in Ethiopian refugee subjects in the American diaspora. These traumatic memories, according to Adebayo, work to provide a shared sense of a traumatic memory community with traumatic subjects elsewhere, what Arthur Christine pointed out earlier. Similarly, the chapter that discusses Tajo's The Shadow of Imana, which is chapter 4, underscores a transnational African attempt to memorialize the 1994 genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda. Overall, these two chapters are convincing in showing that violence in African countries cannot be fully understood if territorialized. Instead, the chapters provide insights into the unboundedness of violence in African countries, as well as the transnational proportions of traumatic memories, as depicted in Mengistu's and Tajo's works. The chapters illuminate, crucially, the African writer's dalliance with traumatic memory as artistic projects enacted as a duty to posterity. Okay, I would like to close by highlighting two crucial points about Adebayo's continuous past. The first concerns what I consider as the book's important contribution to our understanding of post-colonial African fiction of memory as a work of mourning for the millions of Africans crushed unjustly by indescribable violence. And in this intellectual contribution, Continuous Past offers us a prism with which to appreciate some contemporary African writing as a project of mourning and inventory of our shared traumatic pasts and presents. In other words, Continuous Past invites us to read post-colonial African fictions of memory as a funerary stele upon which millions of African victims of atrocities may be rehumanized and properly mourned. And the goal of such artistic projects, to put it in the words of a wise man in Veronique Tajo's The Shadow of Imana, is to give the living another chance. My second point concerns what I consider as a fetish of memory in Adebayo's book. And by fetish of memory, I mean that Continuous Past tends to overread memory in African fiction. If by overread, we understand the book to loosely conflate the past with memory. And by so doing, tends to under-theorize aspects of its engagement with African traumatic memory. And I make this point because I think the book does not clearly theorize its memorial project to allow for an understanding of the relationships between history and memory, or for an understanding of where history begins and ends, and where memory begins and ends. One of the foundational assumptions, I believe, of collective memory studies, at least in the West, is that projects of memory are counterbalance scribal and official history. And by so doing, artistic and other projects of memory, as Richard Slotkin puts it, serve to explore, I'm quoting now, those alternative possibilities for belief, action, and political change unrealized by history, which existed in the past, in order to restore as imaginable possibilities the ideas, movements, and values defeated or discarded in the struggles that produced the modern dispensation, while also serving to produce a counter myth to play into and against the prevailing myths of the present. So one quarrel I have with Continuous Past is that it doesn't elucidate the prevailing myths and histories that have given vent to the counter myths of the memorial projects of the works it discusses. In addition, Continuous Past dwelt on the macro dynamics of traumatic memory, and as such left more to be desired in terms of the nuances and micro dynamics of memory. And I will illustrate briefly using what I mean by the nuances and micro dynamics of traumatic memory by considering Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun.
Chibo, you have 2 minutes.
I'm almost done.
Okay.
Near the end of the novel, just after the war, in Half of a Yellow Sun, Odenigbo and Olanna, facing the Nigerian government's attempts to destroy the memory of Biafra, have to negotiate their traumatic investments in Biafra. Odenigbo's approach is to hide the objects of his Biafra memory and preserve them for posterity as memorabilia. And perhaps memorabilia that in the future can function to destabilize the Nigerian government's official history of that violent past. Olanna, on the other hand, burns her Biafra collectibles. And when Odenigbo accuses her of burning Biafra memory, Olanna retorts that she would rather keep her memory in her mind than in objects that could be seized by the government. Here we are presented with two attitudes to traumatic memory. One memorabilic, an object-oriented, the other psychic and emotive. At the same time, these two attitudes to traumatic memory are presented in the novel as gendered, the former masculine and the latter feminine. I miss these kinds of microdynamic nuances of gender, for example, in Continuous Past. Considering that 3 of the 4 texts discussed in the book are written by African women, I believe that Continuous Past would have benefited with more attention to the dynamics of gender and other identitarian dynamics vis-a-vis traumatic memory in Africa. But perhaps this might be a project for the future after all. The book's title suggests nothing is ever finished. The past and the present do in fact continue into the future. I want to congratulate Dr. Adebayo once again for writing such intellectually stimulating book, and thanks again for having me on this panel.
Chibu, thank you very much for your very, sound and astute critique. Critique is not the same as criticism. So he's laid out a number of vectors to be explored. And I ignored to introduce Chibu Ayanduba properly. He's a professor at the University of Winnipeg in our own wonderful Canada. The next speaker is Fabian Crotwald. Please correct me if I'm mangling your name. Fabian Crotwald is at Princeton University. And I believe, Fabian, you were a historian, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so please maybe say a few words about yourself and proceed. You have 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Otto. Thank you first of all to the Lagos Studies Conference organizers for hosting us, and to Adebayo for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And as Dr. Quayson just mentioned, I'm a historian. I'm a comparative scholar of Eastern and Southern Africa, especially Namibia and Tanzania, where I focus on memories of German colonialism and how they have shaped trajectories of decolonization and the emergence of campaigns for restorative justice since the end of German colonialism in the First World War. And I want to start my comment by reiterating what Ato Quayson said and what I told Adebayo when he first asked me about my impression of the book, which is that I was also struck by its elegance and its economy. Because I think where many authors add on empirical chapters to make either an already well-established point or fight theoretical windmills, Adebayo really arrives at this appealing balance between empirical data and theory. And this penchant for lucidity becomes apparent also in what I deem one of the key passages of the book, which is very short and is found on page 8. And there, Adebayo maintains, quote, that colonialism, among other things, is an attempt to destroy and wipe out a people's memory, end quote. And just by sort of the lucidity of that sentence, it's rarely found this sort of clearly stated. And from this insight, Adebayo then mobilizes the fiction of 4 African writers who are engaged in exploring, recovering, and commemorating lost pasts and foreclosed futures. And as I explained, I am a historian, and my comment will reflect this disciplinary background. And Anyaduba already raised sort of the issue of the difference between history and memory, and I will leave that sort of for the further discussion to delve into and focus on some other issues in my comment. First of all, I would like to praise Adebayo for his even-handed approach to literature as one art of memory among others. Some books weigh disciplines against each other or unduly sort of tout the seemingly unique contributions of their discipline and analysis to the matter at hand. And by contrast, Adebayo really invites us to follow his approach to literary criticism, while also pointing to and incorporating the important work of other scholars in anthropology, in history, in political theory, among others, that have approached similar questions before him. And this generosity, Catholicism of thought, really reflects a deeper grounding in the relevant theoretical and disciplinary literatures of memory and African studies, one that I think we still encounter very rarely. And so my first question is about the framing of your book within Verbner's diagnosis of a crisis of memory, which he made in 1998. The term crisis comes from the Greek verb krinein, which means to decide. Initially, the term referred to a decision as well as to a turning point. And importantly, this turning point can foreshadow developments for the worse or for the better. And Verbner made his diagnosis more than 2 decades ago. So I was somewhat surprised when you emphasized the negative turn of this crisis in your focus on memory frictions. When Verbner was writing, there were still severe memory blockages preventing African societies from engaging in open discourses about the past as the continent was emerging from structural adjustment policies, civil conflict, and authoritarian rule. But arguably, and from a historian's perspective, much has changed since the 1990s. And the literary works and authors you assemble are in some ways the best examples of these changes. Here you have young authors, highly educated, who are often citizens of the world with considerable experience. And although you highlight the generative potential of remembrance through this concept of African transnational memory, I wondered whether the book could have focused more on these harmonies of recollection and the potential for solidarity and progressive change. You explain that friction can be cathartic and productive, but at least in my semantic understanding of the term, it has a predominantly negative connotation in English. And this somewhat pessimistic streak of your analysis comes really out also in the last sentence of the book, where you state that memory threateningly rolls into the present. And my question here is less about whether memory is either inherently bound up with friction or with multidirectionality, either threatening or potentially liberating, but to insist on the heterogeneity of African memory landscapes in which these effects necessarily varied. And if I'm thus pushing you to think more about these optimistic dimensions of your work and the fiction you studied, I also want to express doubts about the degree to which literature as a distinct historical project can bring clarity or closure to societal debates about the past. You emphasize, for example, the archive making of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and other authors in recovering history from suppression and silence. And this is obviously a commendable endeavor, and other works such as Abdul Razak Gurna's Afterlives and Ma'aza Mengistu's The Shadow King also illustrate how powerful a command of the archive can be when mobilized for the ends of post-colonial fiction. But as a historian, I am also worried that these archival forays by authors imbue archives with the very legitimacy of historical accuracy that they always lacked. Because rather than the all-knowing repositories of anthropological and colonial imagination, they are obviously incomplete and vague exercises in guesswork, in not knowing and in pretending to know, and in sometimes occluding knowledge. So what does it mean for post-colonial literature if the archive increasingly becomes a factor in gauging a literary work's accuracy, its ability to engender and deal with memory friction? Are these literary works building blocks in their society's post-colonial nation-making process? Or are they critical arbiters that interrogate not only their country's conflicts of memorialization, but the very basis for knowing the colonial past or any other traumatic past, post-conflict past? And so this point about epistemology relates to a further one about authorship and authority. As you demonstrate, the 4 authors under consideration form part of the 3rd generation of African writers since independence. On page 18, you state that, quote, they are very cosmopolitan, end quote, and their cosmopolitan emerged as a direct result of the crises of the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s, when many writers had to go into exile. Historically speaking, these authors therefore present a distinct strata of African societies in a perhaps more antiquated language, a certain class. They are highly educated, they have worked and lived abroad, either through their own volition or having been forced to. And they now lead transnational, even global lives. So my question is therefore, what would your argument about memory frictions look like if we turn to those quote unquote left behind on the continent? How do writers who did not leave, who could not leave, envision the past and the continents and their country's future after in post-conflict contexts? Could you maintain your argument about wake work, about African transnational memory in a similar way? And do you think that the author's class background has an impact on their prose, the questions it asks, and the possibilities that it foresees? And what if we turned our attention, to example, to writers of the urban precariat? You are attuned to some of these questions as you show, for example, in your discussion of Mengistu's Children of the Revolution, and you highlight the ways in which American capitalism both fascinates and excludes African migrants. But I was still struck by the seeming absence of a fundamental critique of the economic underpinnings of memory and remembrance in these four works, and also potentially revolutionary alternatives to this economic status quo. And this brings me to the concept of African transnational memory, or ATM, as you memorably call it. You present ATM as the antidote of African fiction writers to one of the most pernicious legacies of colonialism, which is, of course, the nation state. And on page 90, you thus claim that, quote, colonialism successfully sold the idea of the nation state as the most desirable form of political community, end quote, on the continent, bringing in its wake virulent nationalism, nativism, and provincialization. But as the work of historians such as Frederick Cooper and others has shown, the nation state was never the proclaimed end goal of decolonization, and certainly not for African nationalists. In fact, colonial empires themselves were often the exact opposite of the nation state, being multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious. If some colonial governments, planners, and ethnographers sold the idea of the nation state, Africans were equally, if not more skilled, salespeople of this idea. And I think the somewhat narrow view of colonialism as the midwife of African nation states is mirrored in your claims about transnationalism and its potentially emancipatory potential. Because you present transnationalism as a solution to nationalist memory silencing and post-colonial forms of exploitation. On page 92, you thus assert that, quote, recent developments such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the introduction of a single currency for countries that are part of ECOWAS, and several other initiatives by the African Union, end quote, are a silver lining for the continent. Yet it is far from clear that these efforts at neoliberal governance will result in new forms of solidarity or cooperation. As research on post-colonial federations in Africa, particularly in West Africa, as well as the European Union has shown, movements of transnational integration often create new inequalities, conflicts, and nativist backlashes, and most memorably, of course, in the case of Brexit. So if African transnational memory, I think, is to help us to critically examine the continent's current global conjuncture, it should be distinguished, I think, from these political efforts in order to be able to provide a critical.
All right, Fabian, you have 2 minutes.
Got it. I'm almost done. In order to provide a critical instrument to review these political developments. And to sum up, these questions and reservations notwithstanding, I really want to reiterate the accomplishment of Adebayo. His book provides an eloquent reading of memory studies from multiple African vantage points, enriching the broader field with his concepts of wake work, African transnational memory, and memory fictions.
Fabian, thank you so much for bringing a very welcome historian's perspective to the discussion. So next we have Chijioke Ona, who is a graduate student at Cornell University. Chijioke, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much, Sakiru, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And thank you so much, Arthur, for going first for doing that elegant review, which means that I'm not going to do any kind of review. But I'm writing a review for a journal, so for a review, anyone could read that. But for now, I think my role in this panel is more of like to celebrate with my friends, celebrate with Adebayo in this very fantastic book, which I enjoy reading so much. And by way of doing that, I am going to think through what I think of the three different ways that reading this book helped me to stimulate questions and concerns about memory studies and African contemporary present. So perhaps the first place to start is just where Fabian just ended on the idea of African transnational memory, ATM, which I love that acronym so much. So perhaps the most expansive idea in Adebayo's book is his concept of African transnational memory framework, which he argues that post-conflict fictions of memory in Africa provide the tools for imagining and theorizing a collective African memory, thus offering us several imaginative possibilities and templates for how post-independence African countries can remember together. If the colonial enterprise could be understood, quote, as an attempt to destroy and wipe out the people's memory, perhaps the anti-colonial projects and the work of decolonization, I think, could be articulated as a struggle over reclaiming a people's memory. One can argue then, and I think Adebayo's book would agree, that the crisis of nation-state in post-colonial Africa is to a large extent a crisis of memory. As I said, my role on this panel is to think, to share how reading Adebayo's book has prompted so many questions in my mind. And thinking about ATM, especially in the light of Nigeria's recent election, I wonder if we can think of Nigeria as a country haunted by its past, its memories or lack of it, or by its open wound of history, unquote. Nigeria, as Adebayo posits, is in a sense still at war. I make this point simply not to show the importance of Adebayo's book in framing and envisioning Africa's present and future, but to extend those stakes at this critical time in thinking about Africa. I ask, for example, whether an African transnational memory framework is enough, or whether it needs to be supplemented, or whether, as I already mentioned, we even need it at all. I agree with Adebayo's point that post-colonial African memory works need to be more attuned to the transnationality of memory in all its modes, especially given the potentials of an ATM to enhance our understanding of the connected histories, shared presence, and common features of African nation states. The rich potential of an ATM framework is clear, and we can come back to that in our discussions. But even for the sake of polemics, I do wonder about the idea of an international memory framework, given the ongoing crisis of various nation states on the continent, as against the idea of transnational. International memory framework seems relevant in our contemporary moment, because it seems to me that while Adebayo's book demonstrates the potentialities of an agonistic memory culture on the continent, his book at the same time gestures towards how the same texts he studies elicited more of an antagonistic memory discourse within the nation states, as the Adichie's case exemplified. In other words, even when a text such as Adichie's of a Yellow Song gestures towards an African transnational memory solidarity, Adebayo claimed that they also deepen the ethnic and sectional divide in Nigeria. I kept wondering to what extent an African transnational memory framework will help us, given that what is tearing the continent apart currently seems to be more of an international memory crisis than a continental one. Put differently, apart from looking for a shared transnational African memory ancestry, as Adebayo suggests, what would a shared intra-Nigerian memory of Biafra look like? The second thing I'm thinking about is his idea of future-oriented memory. Adebayo argues that his exploration of the post-conflict situation in post-colonial Africa in continuous past gestures towards futurity, and he posits that studies and stories about Africa's tumultuous past need to be more future-oriented. According to him, Africa's histories of violence need to be studied in a way that is forward-looking and taught in a way that opens up conversations on how patterns of violence can be disrupted. The memory of the future and the future of memory need to take the primary place in the study of the past in and on Africa, end of quote. What Adebayo is asking of us is not just novel, but as every memory studies scholar would agree, it is also a challenge. Future-oriented memory studies approach sounds exciting and will be an important contributor to the field. This is something I long to see in Adebayo's book. What would a future-oriented approach to memory studies look like? I guess Adebayo shows an example when he explores, even if briefly, how the continuous pace of the past, coupled with lingering injustice in the present, portrays a kind of post-African future that is under siege. But with such an analysis count as future-oriented memory studies, or it is rather in how the various texts, according to Adebayo, depict individuals struggling to embrace the promise of a livable future, or in the novelist's own hope that their works will open up conversations about and possibilities for a reparative future. A future-oriented approach, it seems to me, articulates and envisions a future in which post-colonial Africa's problems of an arrested future, in quotes, gives way to a livable and just future in which the various structures of violence are dismantled and the continent's crying wolves are healed. Why am I chatting about such a project? I'm interested in foregrounding the stakes of memory studies in general and African memory study discourses in particular in articulating such a future. It is the challenge that I long to see in Adebayo's book and one that I hope that he extends on. Finally, for my third musing on Adebayo's book, let me end with the beginning, both in veneration for and with a nod to our ancestors. At the end of chapter 1, which primarily engages with the implication of Mariana Hirsch's concept of post-memory in a post-colonial context, Adebayo briefly offers two provocations. The first is pretty straightforward, which is that Hirsch's post-memory is inadequate in a post-colonial context because it is incapable of articulating the uniquely concatenated and cumulative nature of memory in the post-colony. Which is to say, memory in the African post-colony is hardly as individuated as Hirsch's concept seems to suggest. As what might appear to be the personal memories of many of the characters in the text, or even an individual historical event, may not be unconnected to broad history such as slavery, colonialism, and even recent civil wars on the continent. In a short paragraph, Adebayo suggests that concatenated memory might be a better way to capture the complex layering of memory in a post-colonial context. As he makes clear in the conclusion, memory in the post-colony could be thought of as not simply the memory of a single event, but also as an interconnected chain of events. His second provocation got me more excited. Now, in that very short paragraph, he offers his second provocation, which was inspired by his engagement with Mama at the JS interviews, blowing her publication of her for a low sum. Adebayo offers that in professionalizing memory and in refashioning it for post-colonial context, maybe we could think critically about the idea of ancestral memories. I agree that we should, and I think that you did. But what could ancestral memory mean? And what would it constitute? Adebayo gestures towards some of the framing in a rather poetic paragraph on page 46. Given that this other poetic rendition comes as the penultimate paragraph at the end of chapter 1, one can make the mistake of thinking that this idea is secondary to Adebayo. Maybe it is, but I see its corpus footprints everywhere in the first chapter and subtly throughout the book, starting from when it was first introduced to us in the introductory chapter. I am attracted to this idea of ancestral memory as a post-colonial, African, or dare I say Black diasporic memory practice, whether it is in the slave writing tradition, or in Toni Morrison's Over, or in the broad array of texts that Yojita Goya recently called the neo-slavery narratives. One can speculate on the affordances of ancestral memory for global Black memory culture. Having read the book and the archaeology of the African literary canon that Adebayo curates, one can even hazard to say that these texts are texts in search of the ancestors. After all, we conceptualize postcolonial memory work as being with the dead, an idea that resonates with your earlier works on trauma and memory on Africa. According to Adebayo, the question of memory in the postcolonial is the question of the continual presence of the dead. Postcolonial memory is a marker of the oscillating tension between summoning the dead and laying them to rest, end of quote. Postcolonial narrative is a narrative of mourning, Adebayo continues, and the post-conflict fiction of memory in Africa are engaged in wake work. Wake work, that perfect connection to Christina Sharp's text that connotes the Black diasporic affordances of your ancestral memories I have been musing on. Okay, here's my dream with this fascinating idea. Given its far-reaching implications and given its affordances for articulating a post-colonial memory work, what would it have looked like if your book began with those two brief paragraphs at the end of chapter 1? To put it differently, what if we started with the provocations on post-memory rather than end with them? This is not to regret the very process that offers us that idea, but to foreground the idea and let us think about its broader implication for the book and for the field of memory studies. For example, I ended the book thinking that perhaps the two provocations are not unconnected. If the post-conflict fictions of memory in Africa often present the entanglement of familiar and national histories, thus necessitating this concerted memory framework, an ancestral memory frame already explores the persona and already explores the persona and gestures toward the collective. That is the national or even the transnational is already located in the ancestral. After all, the story of a life immersed in violence is the story of the nation Adebayo offers. Thus, we can see the affordances of the ancestral memory in our teacher's vicarious witness in chapter 1, or in the vicarious responsibility of Elias Cole's conscientious daughter in chapter 2, as well as in the Pan-African memory game in chapter 3, or in the aesthetics of witness in chapter 4. Of course, I am in dalliance with the conclusion that the clearest point brought to bear by the four texts and the chapters in the book is how the past remains an unfinished business, and how that informed the continued negotiation of the meaning of post-conflict nationhood in Africa. But if that memory or crisis that bettered it can be thought of outside of the broad consideration of the ancestral that you offer us. In other words, what would this book look like if conceptualized and framed through the prism of what you call the ancestral memory? Perhaps if we think of ancestral memory in the voice of Tula Nangi's grandmother in Mbolo Ngwe's latest novel, How Beautiful We Were, or in Sadiya Hartman's travelogue, Lose Their Mother, or in the Afrofuturistic Black Panther and Wakanda Forever, or if we think of the theoretical balances of ancestral memory in Adebayo's own book, and how it seems to be a common thread even in most of his previous works, or in the idea of the complex varieties of violence that breeds concatenated memories, or if we think of the specters of the dead in the global Black diasporic, exemplified by Christina Sharp's work.
You have 2 minutes.
Almost done. By Christina Sharp's work of mourning in the wake, perhaps we may not only see that the post-colonial African or global Black ancestral memory is already a concatenated memory, but more importantly, perhaps we can raise another toast to Sakiru Adebayo and his book that offers all this idea, and be able to say to him in the voice of my own late grandmother, Ozobia Koma, which means may more come and may more follow this one. I mean, we gather again soon to celebrate even more ideas from you in the praise of our ancestors. Again, congratulations and thank you for inviting me to join this panel.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me point out one small thing before we move to Chris. I was looking for you. Your head is you have decapitated yourself because of, yes. I didn't want to interrupt you. I said, where's this guy's the top of his head? You know, it's like you are going through a process of ancestral decapitation. But let's put that to one side. So the next, but thank you very much for your contribution. Chris Uma, who is at the department. Sorry, Chris is not around?
No, Prof, he's not here today. He couldn't make it.
Okay. That's all good. So I hope he's all is well with him. So Hannah, forgive me for mispronouncing your name, Hannah Teichler, Is
Very
that it?
welcome. Yeah.
Hannah Teichler, who is a research fellow in the Frankfurt Memory Studies at the Goethe-University, right?
Exactly.
Wonderful. So, Hannah, you have 15 minutes.
Right. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Kaysen, and thanks for having me, Adebayo, as well as this illicit panel today. And in the spirit of my predecessor, Mr. Ona, and good to see you again. Hi from Frankfurt. I see my role here on this panel as providing a raving review of Adebayo's book. There are things to be said in terms of, what books can and cannot do, what, inherent problems they may or may not have. But I think today is first and foremost an instant to celebrate, also this publication to celebrate. And I consider myself a literary scholar as well as a memory studies scholar. So from that vantage point, I'm offering again my reading of Adebayo's book and where I think it can go in the future. And I would appreciate if, in that spirit, my response will be received. And here it goes. Dear friend, allow me to start my response with massive congratulations. What an achievement. To read your book has taught me a lot. To listen to you and work with you over the years has taught me a lot. And it is an honor to be invited to share my thoughts on your book with you. We met at least 10 years ago on occasion of a summer school in Munich. And as you repeatedly stated yourself, I had the pleasure of pointing you in the direction of memory studies. And to what a result, I have to say. I'm immensely proud of your work, and if you allow me some vanity of having played a teeny tiny role in you shaping up to be a prominent memory scholar. I can't wait to see what's next on your agenda, and of course, other than the wonderful handbook on African memory studies that we're at the moment working on. And now to the matter at hand, your book. Your argument starts with a powerful contention. The past in Africa continues and is continued, but it does so with frictions, with fractures, but also with unexpected realignments. It comes with silences, discontinuities, and, in your own words, leaves the country with vulnerable futures. Memory as a public practice, and I think this needs to be emphasized, you convincingly argue, is in crisis on the continent. Yet, your book offers a way of reconceptualizing, of reframing the many pasts of and on the African continent, and thus rightfully sits at the threshold between African studies and memory studies. In your study, you identify African master narratives and the ambiguous and ambivalent sense of the word. There are narratives that are imposed by specific memory politics, colonial memory politics, as well as memory as a form of governing. For example, in the Rwandan or South African case, an argument I find very convincing. You show how these narratives displace and silence others, but are also used as formative memories, which invite to reimagine African pasts with a view to their usability in and for the present. African pasts, you argue, are usable, and that is for better or for worse. Literary texts, as you show us, hold the potential of critically re-evaluating the continuities of Africa's many pasts, in the form of shedding light on how colonial pasts continue to shape the present, how they stifle other memory regimes, but also how certain memories are withheld, suppressed, not talked about, in order to be able to navigate the present. Your primary sources cover a wide range of conflicts on the African continent, and serve, if you so want, as a tour d'horizon of what you call post-conflict memory novels. You work with texts that have achieved canonical status in the vast field that is African literature. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in the Nigerian context, Amina Safona in Sierra Leone, Dina Mengistu and Ethiopia, and Veronique Taju and Rwanda form your literary corpus. With this assembly, you cover a wide range of different forms of conflicts, but you also engage with conflicts that have garnered international attention and authors who have garnered international attention for various reasons. More often than not, these conflicts originate in colonial oppression and/or are the result of continued colonial intrusion. But they are also more than that, as you argue. They provide you with case studies through which you can show how literary texts take on the role of providing counter-memory to hegemonic memory structures, as they serve as alternative sites of memory, which operate outside the confines of what is sayable and what is governmentable. Through your close readings, you thus coin new concepts and establish new terms. The aforementioned genre of post-conflict fictions of memory as a form of writing that ironically, as you argue, resists generic labeling. There is a centrality of mourning and wake work that you highlight, as well as the continual presence of the dead, and you fruitfully connect this to prevalent notions of trauma in the field of memory studies. And you coined the notion of ancestral memory as a concept that both ties in with established memory theory, thinking of multidirectionality, post-memory, and perhaps even prosthetic memory, but pushes their conceptual boundaries well towards African contexts and memory epistemologies. You effectively end up conceptualizing distinct forms as well as recognizable patterns of African transnational memory. And you understand African transnational memory as regional memory work that speaks to the way collective memory in post-conflict African societies is produced and circulated. So the regional as well as the transnational thought together. The memory work that the texts you analyze undertake is thus writing back to the colonial powers, but also writing back to oneself, to the diverse African mnemonic communities, in order to reorient the remembering gaze towards the future, and to, in your own words, open up conversations on how patterns of violence can be disrupted. So what is it that I have learned from your book? I can see that the public practice of memory as a form of political action and government is in crisis, but memory fiction is not. And it has the potential to reshape regional identities as well as broader notions of Africanness that are at play here. Whilst mourning and wake work are central elements of the text you engage with, they are also testament to the potential of fiction to do the work that societies potentially cannot do. And these texts are hopefully used in many contexts around the world, not only in Africa, to foster an understanding of how pasts, in plural, continue, and how they can also be used to break patterns. You show me how and to what extent the colonial past lingers and forms, but you also show that the post is by no means business as usual, as you quote Terry Eagleton in your work, but is very vibrant and very painful memory work. So in this spirit, I have two questions for you that are also somewhat comments, and some of the issues have already been raised by the ones who spoke before me. You repeatedly make use of the word post-colony in your argument, and it seems to me as if post-colony is to be understood as a metonym for Africa. Can you comment on the connection between a self-image of a post-colony in singular and the emergence of a or many collective African memories? What are the conditions for such a collective memory to emerge, and what could be the frames of such collective memory? I think the first speaker raised the issue of whether that is needed at all, this kind of Pan-African frame or lens, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Secondly, I very much like your idea of ancestral memory. Now that you're residing in Canada, and my own PhD was on Canadian memory work, I would like to know to what extent your idea of ancestral memory resonates within the Canadian memory context and Indigenous epistemologies when it comes to memory. And thank you again, my dear friend, for providing us with this excellent study of African memory contexts, and the role of literature in the emergence of a potential African collective memory. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This is shaping to be a very fascinating set of interventions, because Adebayo's book is multi-generative, so people are reading it and it's taking them in different directions. That's wonderful. So now we are going to allow the man himself to respond, and the response is not a point-by-point refutation, it's just a general response. So Adebayo, take it away.
First of all, I want to say thank you all for agreeing to do this, beginning with Professor Atokwesin. Maybe I should say this, that I and Professor Atokwesin and we've not actually met in person. I just wrote to him, and you know how it is sometimes. It can be dreadful to talk to senior scholars, right? And I just wrote to him, and in good faith, he agreed to do this. And so it means a lot to me. Thank you so much, Prof. And also my dearest colleagues, thank you all for agreeing to do this. Again, Hannah, you introduced me to memory studies 10 years ago in Munich. And so this for me is also very important that you're here responding to the book. And Chigo, you know how much I really respect your scholarship, and I invited you here precisely because of your honesty, and I knew that you would leave no stones unturned. So I really, really appreciate that. I appreciate your critique. And Fabian, thank you so much. We have been in the past 2-3 years, we've been exchanging ideas around memory studies in Africa, and I've learned so much from you. Also, as a historian, someone who is not doing literary studies. So thank you for agreeing to be a part of this. And of course, Chijioke, my brother, thank you so much, for doing this, for also just for making me, sometimes I'm just like, what am I doing? But you make me feel like I'm doing serious work all the time. So thank you very much, Shiji, for being here. I must say that I am not very used to this, or this novelty of being taken seriously is giving me some I don't know, but also it makes me to see my book in a very different light, and also teaching me something about what it means to be an author. Like, it comes with a lot of responsibility, right? And yeah, so this is an experience which I take seriously, and hopefully in my next book, I'll think more responsibly and write more responsibly. Yeah, there's so many things that you've laid on the table, beginning with Prof saying that, it's concise, go straight to the point. And I guess it's also part of my maybe personality. It's kind of personality reflecting in theory, but also in intellectual work, just go straight to the point. And yeah, so there are so many questions here. I think almost everyone touched on the idea of African transnational memory. And I thought maybe it's important for me to just mention that now that I'm listening to all of you, that I did my PhD in South Africa. And listening to all of you now, I was thinking that if I had done my PhD in North America, maybe this ATM thing would not have come out the way it has. And the reason I'm saying that is because when I moved to South Africa from Nigeria, it was very shocking to me how much we don't know about each other, as Africans, how much we don't. And I don't know, like, if you remember from Chimamanda Adichie's Danger of a Single Story, where she says, like, people ask me about Africa not knowing that I have no idea what Namibia is, or what, where Namibia is. So one of the shocking realities for me of doing my PhD in another African country was the fact that especially contemporary, like, new generation of Africans, we do not know a lot about each other. We only, there seems to be more stereotypical knowledge of what other African countries are about. And then there is also the problem of xenophobic nationalism, and so these are things that made me to think about how we can bridge this divide. And I thought maybe memory would have something to say to that. And so that's for another instance that I will give, which I think even Veronique Tajo gives in her book, is that if you're traveling from, say, Namibia to Togo, you might have to go through France to actually go to Togo. That's how much disconnected if I can use that word, that many African countries seem to be. So as a memory scholar, I'm thinking of what memory can contribute to that. And reading all of these books, I realized that, wait a minute, things have not always been like this. The African nationalism, if you read the history of African nationalism, it was really transnational. Pan-Africanism, the first Pan-African meeting was actually even in London, I think. So yes, so I was thinking about what memory could contribute to thinking collectively and remembering together. And maybe we think of memory as a soft power. I'm not necessarily thinking of the big political discourses, but like what memory can do for us if we remember together. And people are already doing that. Like I said in the book, it's not necessarily a new idea. For example, in South Africa, we have a Rwandan genocide memorial. In fact, 3 Rwandan genocide memorials, one in Johannesburg, one in Durban, another one in Cape Town. And Senegal is another, exciting place for this. So I guess what I'm saying is that my idea of African transnational memory is basically looking at memory traces, if that is in the form of memorials, of monuments, or museums. And I'm taking the cue from even the European Union, for example, here. So Senegal is another place where it seems to be there is a consciousness around that. So you can think of the African Renaissance Monument, which is a transnational monument, or even the recent Museum of Black Civilizations, I think, that has just so in Senegal. So those are the ways that I was thinking about African transnational memory, what memory could contribute to the idea of xenophobic nationalism, but also the collective amnesia that has swept across the continent of, transnational connections, during anti-colonial struggles. The other side of that, and Anna, you actually really helped me to put it so well, is that I'm also thinking with the memory studies as an association, as a discipline, right? Where so the idea of regional memory, because the memory studies is moving towards transnationality in the way that they do their work. And they're moving beyond methodological nationalism. But what I also noticed there was the silence around African memory in this idea of transnational global memory. So my idea of African transnational memory therefore becomes a kind of regional memory work within memory studies. So I guess for me, one of the struggles of doing this work was trying to appeal to an African studies audience, at the same time a memory studies audience, right? So that is that about African transnational memory. I must also say from all the comments that perhaps I had overstated the role of fiction in being an alternative to official memory narratives, because even from what you all are saying, I'm reminded of the fact that sometimes even fiction, and I kind of try to state that also in the book, how fiction can cause frictions, and how writers can romanticize the past or infuse biases. There is a saying that truth is stranger than fiction, or maybe fiction is stranger than truth, if that makes any sense. So maybe I might have overstated the role of fiction, or not given enough, to the critique of fiction itself as a vector of memory in the book. And thank you so much, Chijioke, for taking up this idea of ancestral memory. You said it so well in the way that I didn't even say in the book. You said that the texts are in search of ancestors, and I couldn't agree more. And I agree with your critique of starting with ancestral memory, right? I guess again, this like you said yourself, I guess this is for future work, like future projects, how to elaborate on this idea of ancestral memory, and people like you also taking it up. I really appreciate the way that you have dissected it. And yeah, and also all the reference to wake work. I just want to state clearly that is not really my idea. I borrow that from Christina Sharp, of course. And there is a question that Chigo talked about that I would like to address. Yes, half of Yellowstone as a post-memory work. And the why half of a Yellowstone as a post-memory work. And I want to say that half of a Yellowstone is so close to my heart, and that perhaps answers partly your question, Chijioke, about what how a shared memory, Nigerian memory of Biafra, what that can look like, because I am not from the Igbo tribe. But and I would say this, that even the things that Chigo was mentioning, these were things that the anonymous reviewers also mentioned. And I intentionally wanted to leave it like my reading like that. Intentionally they even suggested that I should bring another chapter to chapter 1 rather than Half of Yellowstone. But for me, because Half of Yellowstone is so close to my heart, I just wanted to be the first encounter for my readers, precisely because for me, I learned about Biafra in the university. Like, can you imagine that? I didn't know about Biafra when in high school, at home, nobody talks about it. But then it was one of my wonderful Professor oh my God. Okay. Professor Remy Oriaku, he taught us half of a Yellowstone, and that I found I was blown away. I didn't know that this was part of the history of my country. I had to go back and ask people, and even my parent, that, what was this all about? So that was the reason, first of all, why I wanted to retain the kind of reading that I did with that book there, but also to leave it in the first chapter precisely because it's close to my heart. But then the second thing is that so one of the things I wanted to do was not to just give people close literary readings in all the chapters. I wanted to do some kind of extra textual reading, and Adichie's novel afforded me that. So my idea of post-memory is not necessarily within the world of the novel itself, but rather asking a basic question: what does it mean to write about something that you are not a direct witness of? So I am thinking of the whole of Half of Yellowstone itself as a work of post-memory, not necessarily the storyline, as post-memorial. So that's why I had to engage rather with Adichie's interviews, which was kind of a little difficult for me because I do not have training. My training is in close reading, is in literary reading, right? But I want to be able to answer that question of how do you write about a past that you are not a direct witness of in relation to Half of Yellowstone. I think that it was necessary that I went outside of the text, to be able to do that. And also just to not bore my readers with only close readings of the novels themselves, but also give them other things, because memory studies is very interdisciplinary, and I want a situation where historians like Fabian and anthropologists can be able to read my book and take something away from it rather than just literary scholars. And maybe again, I have overstated the role of fiction, importance of Half of Yellowstone in disrupting and troubling the memory of Biafra in Nigeria. But I think that you would agree with me that Half of Yellowstone.
You have 2 minutes. I've just been notified that we have only 13 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Okay. So thank you, Prof. I would just finally say that Half of Yellowstone is also special for everyone, not only in Nigeria, because it was a project that even Hollywood, took up, and it was made into a movie, which was a lot of issues. It had a lot of issues in Nigeria. The Nigerian government didn't want the movie to be played because they were afraid it would incite ethnic violence. So maybe to end that, I might have overstated the role of fiction, but at the same time, with the example of Half of Yellowstone being made into a film and being rejected by the Nigerian government, maybe fiction is much more powerful than we think. And yeah, I would end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone. I have lots of things to say, but just very quickly, is the elusiveness of the referential locus of the not just the traumatic event, but the collective traumatic event. So conflict, war, these are often a series of events concatenated, to take your word, together. But they then generate a problem of the referential locus. So when people are memorializing, whether it's formal memorials or individuals remembering, they're actually not remembering exactly the same point of the event. So the problem of the referential locus is central to, I think, or it ought to be theorized as part of ATM. Yeah. The second thing is that it's interesting that you said you only learned about the Biafra War at school. I only learned about slavery when I left Ghana. No one talked about it. It was slavery was discussed as an episode, and actually a minor episode. So I grew up, went to university, started my career in Ghana. And slavery never featured as, something, a prism to think through identity. It was only when I left the country that it became more and more magnified. So there's a degree to which our local educational systems necessarily distorts the past. So the entire Nigerian, from what you say, the entire Nigerian educational system distorts the past to excise, to remove Biafra. In my case in Ghana, the educational system, and I was not the only one, it distorts, it presents a certain kind of past in order to, as it were, to raise the status of the political elites, those who gained us independence. They are the ones who loom. So the colonialism and those who overthrew colonialism looms high in the educational mentality. But the effect of that is to obliterate, other things. Anyway, there are lots of things that we could say. However, I want to invite you all to join. I want to curate. Let me put it this way. I want to curate a forum on Adebayo's book in my journal, the Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry. Now, the way it will work, I'm going to write to each of you. You should write up your comments. And I don't want, this is not a review forum. So you have to engage with different aspects of the book and take it in different directions. Chigo's critique, for example, was very good. All of you. So I don't expect you to summarize anything. This is a real deep down engagement. It will be 3,000 words each. So you have 3,000 words to write up. And then I'll send your comments to Adebayo, and then he writes a response. And the deadline, I'm going to write all this in the email. The deadline for sending everything is August 1st. So you have time. And then hopefully I will put it into the issue 11.1, which comes out, I think, in January. So 11.1 comes out in January. I'll write to you all. And the forum is, it's a book forum. And the objective is to get people different perspectives of how to read Adebayo's book. I've done forums for different people, and I tend to favor forums on the books of junior scholars, so this is one of them. I'm going to write to you all. It's been a wonderful occasion. Thank you so much, Adebayo, first of all, for writing this book. In Accra, I work on trotro slogans. one slogan that I really like is just simply put, it says, "You too can try." And "you too can try" is referring to the fact that you think what I've done is easy. You too go and try it and see. It's on the back of a taxi. You too can try. So we're all going to try. But thank you so much. Lovely to see you all. You receive an email from me shortly, setting up the terms of the book forum in PLI. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to take questions from the audience because I think there's only, how many minutes do we have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. We have 5 minutes. Maybe one very brief question from the audience. One very, very brief question, and then we really have to stop. They're going to kick us out. If not, well, if not, there is. Thank you all. Yes, I can't see a raised hand. So, has anyone raised their hand? Yeah. Press the raised hand.
Oh, okay. I think someone in the LSA in Lagos wants.
I was at the back of the laptop, so that's why you couldn't see.
Yeah, okay. So a brief question.
All right, thank you very much, Sakiru, and to all the panelists for those quite, provocative readings. This book. This came up in one of the, readings, but I just want Sakiru to reflect a little more on that, just to hear a little bit of your thought. Where does history end, and where does memory, take off? This is the question that I have. With regard to
Yes, okay. Thank you very much.
You respond very briefly because they're going to kick us out. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes. This is a very huge debate in memory studies that we can spend 2 hours answering. But I will say that fiction is not necessarily interested in historical facts, but rather maybe historicity, and that fiction is more important to memory, in the sense that memory offers us something that history might not offer us, which is the emotional truth about an event. Fiction might just give you the facts, but history might just give you the fact and the accuracy, but fiction even gives you much more: the historicity, the emotional truth. And that's the simplistic way that I can answer this in a short time. I know that the historians here would disagree with me, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you all. Thank you all. Bye.